At precisely 4:53 in the afternoon on a mundane Monday, the stable ground beneath the feet of 40 million Japanese citizens began to tremble with a violent and terrifying force. Within less than 30 seconds, the National Meteorological Agency performed an action that, throughout its entire history of existence, it had never once dared to execute until this very fateful moment. In the coastal towns of Sanriku, young students were just finishing their final classes, laughing while walking home, completely unaware that the sea was preparing to reclaim the silent shore. Miles away on the deep ocean, veteran fishermen felt a strange, rhythmic thumping against their wooden hulls, a vibration that signaled the awakening of a sleeping giant deep under the crust. Inside the high-security perimeter of the Fukushima nuclear complex, weary technicians stopped their routine inspections as the massive concrete walls began to groan under the stress of the mounting seismic pressure. The shockwaves radiated outward with lethal precision, tearing through 7 different provinces and shattering the quiet peace of a nation that had spent 15 years trying to forget the previous nightmare. Across the high-speed rail network, the iconic white Shinkansen trains ground to a sudden, screeching halt, standing frozen like metallic ghosts against the backdrop of the shifting, unstable Japanese landscape. Suddenly, every single mobile phone across the entire archipelago erupted simultaneously with a piercing, haunting siren, a sound that 40 million people immediately recognized from the dark days of 2011. It was the same digital scream that had preceded the wall of black water 15 years ago, a chilling melody of disaster that froze the blood of every man, woman, and child. Panic began to ripple through the crowded streets of Tokyo as the skyscrapers swayed like tall grass in a storm, throwing shadows across a population gripped by a collective, suffocating fear. But as the dust settled from this initial 7.7 magnitude disaster, the senior scientists huddled inside their bunkers realized that the worst was actually yet to arrive on these shores. While the world watched the flickering news reports of the trembling earth, a much darker realization began to dawn upon the experts monitoring the deep, invisible fissures of the Pacific Plate. They knew that the massive tremor was not just a single event, but rather a final warning shot from a tectonic system that had reached its absolute limit of physical endurance. The data streaming onto their monitors suggested a terrifying truth that was far more dangerous than the 7.7 magnitude earthquake that had just shattered the peace of the late afternoon. Behind the closed doors of the emergency command center, the head seismologist whispered a sentence that would keep the global scientific community awake for the next several terrifying and uncertain weeks. "It is not the earthquake that just happened that truly scares us," he said, staring at the red lines. "It is the one that is now definitely coming." To truly understand why the modern nation of Japan is trembling with such profound fear today, we must first look back at a cold morning in March 15 years ago. History has a cruel and repetitive way of whispering its warnings, and for those who were watching the sensors in 2011, the signs were starting to emerge slowly. 2 full days before the Great Catastrophe, a significant foreshock, measuring 7.2 on the magnitude scale, had already rattled the jagged coastline of the northeastern Sanriku region. At that precise moment in time, the most brilliant scientific minds in the country observed the seismic activity but could never have predicted the absolute horror that was coming. Then, exactly 48 hours later, a massive section of the deep ocean floor, measuring 400 kilometers in length, was torn apart by an unimaginable force of nature. The resulting energy release was so incredibly powerful that the entire main island of Honshu was physically shoved nearly 8 feet closer toward the distant continent of North America. Deep beneath the churning surface of the Pacific, the crustal plates groaned as the Earth's axis itself shifted by several inches, altering the very rotation of our planetary home. A wall of water reaching a terrifying height of 130 feet began its relentless march toward the shore, moving with the speed of a commercial jet aircraft. In the small, quiet town of Otsuchi, the residents had only minutes to run for their lives before 10% of their entire population was swallowed by the dark tide. Families were separated in a heartbeat, and the beautiful landscape that people had called home for generations was erased by the churning debris and the weight of the freezing sea. At the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, The massive concrete seawall stood 33 feet high, but it was no match for the 46-foot wave that crashed over it. The critical cooling systems failed almost immediately as the salt water drowned the emergency generators, leading to the catastrophic melting of 3 active nuclear reactor cores within the facility. Today, in the year 2026, over 880 tons of highly radioactive molten fuel still remain trapped deep inside those ruined and inaccessible concrete containment structures. This toxic and dangerous legacy of the past has become a ticking time bomb, sitting quietly in the shadows while the ground begins to shift once again in the present. The recent 7.7 magnitude earthquake that occurred this Monday struck a location that is exactly 150 kilometers away from the fragile site of Fukushima. For the engineers who are still working to decommission the ruined plant, the sound of the seismic alarms is a haunting reminder of the night the world almost ended. They understand better than anyone else that the structural integrity of the damaged buildings might not be able to withstand another massive blow from the restless tectonic plates below. The ghosts of 2011 are no longer just memories, but are now active participants in an unfolding crisis that threatens to finish what the previous disaster started so long ago. Every single crack in the earth and every small tremor felt by the people of Sanriku brings back the suffocating trauma of the water that took everything from them. As the sun begins to set over the jagged coast, the realization that the past and present are colliding creates a sense of dread that no words can fully describe. This is the specific part of the story that even the most experienced and veteran seismologists in the country are often too afraid to discuss in a public setting. To understand the gravity of the current situation, we must explore a complex scientific phenomenon known to the global research community as the mechanism of seismic stress transfer. When one massive section of a tectonic fault line finally slips and breaks, the immense physical pressure does not simply vanish, but instead moves into the adjacent neighboring segments. According to the official statistical models provided by the Japan Meteorological Agency, the normal probability of a magnitude 8 earthquake occurring was only 0.1%. However, following the violent events of this past Monday afternoon, that specific probability has suddenly jumped to 1%. Representing a terrifying tenfold increase in the overall risk level. While a 1% chance might sound small to the average person, in the precise world of earthquake science, this represents a massive red alert for an imminent disaster. The legendary Japan Trench stretches for over 600 kilometers along the ocean floor, and the section that just slipped connects directly to the area that destroyed the country. Several internal whistleblowers and independent researchers have recently suggested that the official estimate of a tenfold risk increase might actually be a very conservative and dangerously low calculation. For the first time in many decades, the government has been forced to activate a specialized protocol known officially as the Subsequent Earthquake Advisory for the remote northern coastal regions. This specific legal document was drafted long ago for a worst-case scenario, but it remained untouched on a dusty shelf until the cold month of December 2025. Now, for the second time in less than 6 months, the national authorities have issued this haunting warning, signaling that the tectonic plates are no longer behaving in predictable ways. Scientists are monitoring deep-sea sensors that show the crust is warping at an alarming rate, suggesting that a much larger rupture is preparing to tear through the ocean floor. The tension along the subduction zone is currently at its highest level in over a century, leaving experts with a profound sense of helplessness as they watch the incoming data. Every single vibration recorded by the sensitive instruments tells a story of a geological giant that is slowly waking up from a deep sleep and preparing to unleash its fury. But even as the northern coast prepares for the worst, a different and much more dangerous specter is starting to haunt the waters 800 kilometers to the southwest. Deep within the shadows of the Nankai Trough, another massive fault line has been quietly accumulating a lethal amount of energy for more than 80 long and silent years. If the Japan Trench is viewed as an open and bleeding wound, then the Nankai Trough must be considered a massive ticking time bomb buried deep beneath the waves. This terrifying geological feature stretches for 800 kilometers along the southern coast, lurking silently while it waits for its inevitable and destructive cycle to begin once again. Historical records indicate that this specific fault line has erupted with devastating force every 100 to 200 years, leaving a trail of absolute ruin across the islands. The last major rupture occurred in the year 1946, meaning that the hidden pressure has been building relentlessly for more than 80 long and incredibly dangerous years now. In the year 2025, the national government released a chilling report estimating that a worst-case scenario could result in nearly 300,000 innocent lives being lost forever. Scientists calculated that over 215,000 of those fatalities would be caused by a massive tsunami that would arrive just minutes after the initial violent shaking. The economic devastation would be equally staggering, with projected damages reaching 292 trillion yen, a figure that actually exceeds the total annual wealth of the nation. Modern researchers are now deeply concerned that the stress transfer from the recent events in the north could finally trigger this sleeping monster into a state of active eruption. Every single piece of data collected from the earthquake on Monday is being analyzed to see if the delicate balance of the Nankai Trough has been permanently and fatally disturbed. Deep sea sensors along the southern coast are currently detecting subtle vibrations that suggest the tectonic plates are beginning to grind against each other with a new intensity. If the Nankai Trough were to break today, it would generate a wall of water so tall that it would easily bypass almost every coastal defense system ever constructed. Coastal cities that are home to millions of people would have less than 10 minutes to evacuate before the ocean arrived to claim the land in a violent surge. The psychological weight of this looming threat has created a heavy atmosphere of dread that hangs over the entire southern coastline like a dark and suffocating storm cloud. Disaster experts warn that the window of opportunity for preparation is rapidly closing as the geological clock continues to tick toward a moment that no one can truly escape. For many scientists, the most terrifying question is no longer whether this catastrophe will happen, but exactly how many more hours or days the country has left to prepare. At 4:53 in the afternoon in the city of Hachinohe, courageous teachers immediately gathered their frightened young students and began a desperate sprint toward the highest ground available nearby. Off the coast of Kuji, veteran fishermen heard the chilling emergency broadcast over their radios and were forced to decide between returning to shore or facing the massive waves at sea. In the devastated city of Rikuzentakata, residents began climbing the exact same concrete evacuation stairs they had scaled 15 years ago, but this time they were carrying their young, innocent children. The brand new municipal office building in Otsuchi, constructed on high ground with 8 sturdy floors, opened its heavy doors to provide a sanctuary for thousands throughout the long, dark night. Near the silent reactors of Fukushima, dedicated workers walked along the massive seawall every 30 minutes to manually inspect the critical sensors that would signal an incoming wall of black water. For the survivors of the previous disaster, the sound of the seismic siren was not just a warning, but a physical weight that pressed down on their hearts with suffocating intensity. One survivor, interviewed by the national broadcaster, whispered a single sentence that echoed the feelings of millions, stating that they knew exactly what this terrible and familiar sound truly meant. In the shelters, families sat in silence while holding each other tightly, listening to the wind and the distant roar of the ocean while waiting for news that might never arrive. Despite the overwhelming fear that gripped their souls, the people of the northeastern coast displayed an incredible and quiet resilience that has defined their long history of surviving against impossible odds. As the long night stretched on, the lights of the evacuation centers remained burning like tiny beacons of hope against the vast and threatening darkness of the restless Pacific Ocean. In the abandoned coastal streets below, the only sound was the haunting, rhythmic crying of the emergency sirens, echoing off the empty buildings that stood waiting for the inevitable ocean tide. Every person on the edge of the abyss understood that their lives had been changed forever in less than a single minute of violent shaking from the deep earth below them. As the first light of dawn began to touch the horizon, the people remained on the hills, staring at the sea with eyes that had seen too much tragedy already. The legacy of the previous disaster had taught them that the ocean is a beautiful but merciless god that can take everything away in a single moment of absolute fury. In this moment of extreme crisis, the boundaries of society vanished as strangers helped each other climb to safety, sharing blankets and whispered words of comfort in the freezing night air. While I am writing these specific lines of the script, the official emergency warning issued by the national government still remains fully in effect for millions of people across the country. The iconic white Shinkansen trains have finally begun to move across the landscape once again, but they are operating at significantly reduced speeds to ensure the absolute safety of every passenger. Although the immediate tsunami warnings have been lifted at almost every major port, the local fishing boats still remain tied silently at the docks as if waiting for a signal. There are exactly 6 long and uncertain days remaining until the special advisory is scheduled to expire at the stroke of midnight on the 27th day of the month of April. The true scientific question haunting the experts is no longer if a disaster will occur, but rather what the ancient tectonic plates are trying to communicate to our fragile modern civilization. History reminds us of the repeating cycles of 1896, 1933, and 2011, where the resilient Sanriku coastline was forced to rebuild itself from the ashes every time. The massive Pacific Plate is currently sinking beneath the islands of Japan at a relentless rate of exactly 9 centimeters during every single passing year of our modern human calendar. This geological process does not know the meaning of fatigue, and it will never stop its slow, grinding march until the very foundations of the Earth are completely and utterly reshaped. The only profound question that the entire global scientific community has failed to answer is whether the human race will have enough time to prepare before the next disaster arrives. As the sun sets once again over the horizon, the people of Japan stand on the edge of the abyss, listening to the silent and terrifying movements of the world below.